A billionaire takes her daughter to dinner expecting another controlled, polished public appearance. But before the night is over, she will walk away with her worldview shaken, her heart cracked open, and a decision no one in the restaurant will ever forget. The five-star restaurant Grand Aurora glittered beneath towering crystal chandeliers that cast warm golden light over white marble floors and silk-draped walls. The kind of place where power brokers whispered over aged wine and reputations were quietly built or destroyed between courses. And into this carefully curated world stepped Savannah Whitmore, the 34-year-old blonde American tech billionaire whose name dominated financial headlines and whose icy composure had become both her brand and her shield. She wore a sleek ivory gown that fell effortlessly against her tall frame, diamond studs catching the light with every measured step. And beside her walked her 11-year-old daughter Chloe, dressed in a soft blue dress and white cardigan. Her fingers curled tightly around her mother's hand as flashes from discreet cameras flickered near the entrance, because even a simple dinner outing for Savannah Whitmore was never entirely private. Chloe leaned closer, her voice small beneath the hum of conversation, whispering, "Mom, it's really loud." And Savannah gave her a brief, reassuring smile, the kind perfected in boardrooms and investor meetings, before guiding her toward the VIP section that had been reserved in advance for what her public relations team had described as a gentle reintroduction of her maternal image after weeks of brutal corporate negotiations. Savannah's life ran on precision and timing. Every appearance was intentional, every word calibrated, every moment optimized for impact. Yet just as they approached the velvet-partitioned private lounge, Chloe abruptly stopped walking, her gaze fixed across the main dining room where a single father sat at a modest two-top table in the corner. His navy button-down sleeves rolled to his forearms as he carefully cut steak into neat pieces for his 10-year-old son, who was animatedly describing what sounded like a science experiment gone wrong at school, while trying not to laugh with a mouth full of mashed potatoes. The father's name was Ryan Carter, though Savannah did not know that yet, and his son Mason beamed up at him with unfiltered joy that seemed completely untouched by the luxury surrounding them. And Chloe tugged gently at her mother's hand and whispered, "Can we sit with them?" The request startled Savannah more than she let on, because Chloe was usually reserved in public settings, polite but quiet, rarely asking for anything outside the routine, and the floor manager, noticing the pause, hurried forward with a deferential nod and said softly, "Ms. Whitmore, your private suite is prepared," casting a subtle glance toward Ryan's table that communicated exactly what he thought of mixing worlds. Savannah followed her daughter's gaze again and watched as Ryan dabbed a napkin at Mason's cheek, laughing quietly at whatever story he had just heard, and she noticed something unfamiliar tightening in her chest, a realization that the connection between that father and son was effortless, unscripted, and entirely unmonitored by assistants or schedules. "Mom, please," Chloe insisted in a tone that carried more longing than excitement, and Savannah, whose entire empire had been built on decisive action, made an unexpected choice that even surprised herself. She turned away from the VIP entrance and walked directly across the dining room floor toward the small corner table, her heels echoing against marble as conversations subtly hushed in her wake. Ryan looked up mid-sentence, recognition flashing across his face as he nearly knocked over his water glass, clearly aware of who stood before him, and Savannah spoke with calm authority, though there was an unfamiliar softness beneath it, saying, "My daughter would like to join you for dinner. Would that be all right?" Mason's eyes widened with delight and he quickly scooted his chair over, declaring, "Yeah, there's room," while Ryan, still slightly stunned, rose politely and nodded, replying, "Of course, ma'am," though Savannah gently corrected him with, "Savannah is fine." Chloe slid into the chair beside Mason as if she had been waiting all evening for this exact moment, and within seconds the two children were discussing favorite teachers, video games, and the upcoming school science fair, their laughter blending naturally in a way that felt completely disconnected from the formal setting around them. Savannah and Ryan sat across from one another in an initial silence that held equal parts curiosity and contrast. She noticed the faint calluses on his hands and the tired but kind steadiness in his eyes, while he seemed acutely aware of the expensive perfume, the subtle security presence at a distance, and the enormous gap between their lifestyles. When the waiter approached and hesitated briefly, clearly uncertain how to address the blended table, Ryan calmly ordered the least expensive entree without hesitation, and Savannah observed the lack of embarrassment in his tone, the quiet dignity with which he navigated a space that was not designed for him, while Chloe leaned toward Mason and whispered something that made both children burst into uncontrollable giggles. Savannah felt a flicker of something she could not immediately name. Envy, perhaps, because her daughter rarely laughed that freely at corporate dinners or charity galas, and as Ryan leaned forward to ask Mason about his math test, listening with full attention, nodding thoughtfully, offering encouragement without distraction, Savannah realized with unsettling clarity that no assistant could replicate that kind of presence. She had provided Chloe with elite tutors, structured enrichment programs, security details, and a meticulously designed future. Yet here at this humble corner table sat a father whose most valuable asset appeared to be time. And as Chloe looked up at Ryan while he explained how he once fixed an entire building's broken heating system in the middle of winter, her expression held admiration that pierced Savannah's carefully constructed armor. Around them, whispers began to circulate among other diners, a mixture of curiosity and judgment at the sight of America's most disciplined female seated beside an ordinary single father. But Savannah ignored it for once, focusing instead on the unexpected warmth rising from the simple exchange unfolding before her, unaware that this spontaneous decision to change tables would soon trigger a chain of events neither wealth nor status could control, and that before the night ended, she would be forced to confront a vulnerability she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. A single decision to share a table was about to spiral into a moment that would expose not just a billionaire's vulnerability, but the quiet strength of a man the world would have otherwise overlooked. The laughter between Chloe and Mason continued to rise above the soft clinking of crystal glasses, and for a fleeting stretch of time, Savannah Whitmore allowed herself to forget the pressure waiting outside the restaurant doors, watching her daughter lean closer to Mason as he animatedly described building a homemade rocket for the school science fair, while Ryan nodded proudly and reminded him not to exaggerate the height it had actually reached. Savannah noticed how Ryan listened, truly listened, without checking a phone, without scanning the room, without mentally calculating the next obligation, and when Mason's fork slipped from his hand, Ryan instinctively steadied the plate before it tipped, offering a quiet smile that carried reassurance rather than reprimand. It was such a small gesture, yet Chloe's eyes followed it carefully, absorbing the tenderness in a way that made Savannah's chest tighten again with something far less comfortable than admiration. The surrounding tables, however, were no longer pretending not to notice. Whispers sharpened, heads angled, and a well-dressed woman near the center of the room murmured just loud enough to carry. "I suppose even billionaires get bored of their own kind," drawing a few restrained chuckles from her companions. Ryan stiffened slightly but kept his focus on Mason, while Savannah's posture straightened with instinctive authority, her reputation built on dismantling critics with a single sentence. Yet before she could respond, her assistant hurried across the marble floor, heels clicking urgently, face pale and breath tight. "Savannah," she said in a hushed but frantic tone, "the board has called an emergency meeting. There's concern about the overseas merger delay, and some shareholders are questioning your leadership. They're using the stock dip this morning as leverage." The words landed heavily, stacking on top of weeks of relentless negotiations, 3 consecutive nights of minimal sleep, and a schedule that had not included a proper meal in days. Savannah felt the restaurant lights grow harsher, the sound around her dulling into a distant hum as Chloe's voice faded into the background. She inhaled slowly, intending to respond with the same calculated calm she had perfected in hostile boardrooms, but instead her vision blurred at the edges, her pulse accelerating in uneven ways as a cold sweat prickled at her temples. Chloe noticed first. "Mom?" she asked softly, her smile vanishing. Savannah attempted to stand, perhaps to regain control through movement, but the floor shifted beneath her heels, and the room tilted sharply, her hand reaching instinctively for the edge of the table as her breath shortened into shallow fragments. Conversation stopped completely now, the spectacle undeniable, and before Savannah could steady herself, her knees buckled. Ryan moved faster than thought. He caught her firmly before she struck the floor, guiding her back into the booth with controlled precision. His voice suddenly transformed from casual warmth to calm command. "Savannah, look at me," he instructed, one hand supporting her shoulder while the other reached for a nearby glass of juice from a passing tray. "You're lightheaded because your blood sugar has dropped and your body's overloaded with stress. Slow breaths. In through your nose." Chloe stood frozen beside them, fear washing over her small face. Is she going to faint? Is she leaving? The panic in her voice cut deeper than the corporate news ever could. Ryan kept his tone steady, anchoring both mother and daughter at once. "She's not going anywhere. Stay close. She just needs a minute." He pressed the juice gently into Savannah's hand. "Drink." For once in her life, Savannah obeyed without argument, her pride too weak to resist the simple clarity in his instructions. The sugar hit her system gradually, her breathing beginning to steady as the spinning slowed, and Ryan monitored her pulse discreetly, his thumb resting lightly against her wrist with the practiced awareness of someone who had done this many times before. When Savannah finally found her voice, it was stripped of its usual edge. "How did you know what to do?" she asked, eyes searching his face not as a CEO assessing competence, but as a woman startled by rescue. Ryan hesitated briefly, then answered with quiet honesty. "I was an emergency physician. Trauma medicine. I stepped away after my wife passed. I wanted to raise Mason myself." The admission hung between them heavier than the whispers had. Savannah blinked, processing the revelation. This man in a modest shirt, who ordered the least expensive dish without shame, who radiated calm instead of ambition, had once thrived in operating rooms where seconds determined survival. Chloe suddenly wrapped her arms around Ryan's waist without hesitation. "Thank you for helping my mom," she said, voice trembling but sincere, and Mason added proudly, "My dad fixes everything." Savannah felt the words land deeper than the board's threats ever could. Fixes everything. She had built a billion-dollar empire solving global inefficiencies, yet in her daughter's most frightened moment, she had been the one collapsing, not stabilizing. The assistant hovered nearby, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat, while diners watched with open fascination now, the narrative shifting from gossip to genuine concern. Savannah sat upright slowly, regaining composure but not indifference, because something irreversible had just occurred. Chloe was no longer looking at her with awe or distance, but with raw fear of losing her, and she realized with startling clarity that the relentless pace she had justified as necessary leadership was eroding the very security her daughter needed most. Ryan released her wrist once satisfied with her pulse, though his gaze remained attentive. "You're exhausted," he said gently, not accusatory but factual. "You can't run a company or be a parent on empty." No one had ever spoken to her that way. Not her board, not her executives, not even her closest advisors. The truth was delivered without agenda, without intimidation, without expectation. Savannah inhaled again, this time fully, and looked at Chloe, who was still clutching her hand tightly. "I'm okay," she assured her daughter, though she now understood that being okay required more than survival. Around them, conversation cautiously resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The billionaire was no longer untouchable marble and steel, but human and fragile under too much weight. Savannah made a decision then, one less calculated and far more instinctive than any corporate maneuver she had executed in years. She turned back to Ryan and said quietly, "Would you and Mason join us somewhere more private? I'd like to thank you properly." It was not charity in her voice. It was respect. And as Chloe refused to let go of Ryan's hand while Mason eagerly agreed, the night that had begun as a polished image management dinner was transforming into something far more unpredictable, because vulnerability, once revealed, could not be resealed, and Savannah Whitmore was beginning to understand that the greatest risk she faced was not losing control of her company, but losing the connection she had almost allowed to slip away from her daughter forever. The dinner that was meant to polish a billionaire's image would instead end with a decision that reshaped her company, her priorities, and the future of 4 lives standing quietly on the edge of something entirely new. After the scene in the restaurant settled and Savannah regained her strength, she led Ryan, Mason, and Chloe through a discreet side corridor into a private lounge reserved for high-profile guests, the door closing softly behind them and muting the outside whispers that had followed her collapse. The room was warm with amber lighting and deep leather chairs. But for the first time that evening, Savannah did not feel like the most powerful presence inside it. Chloe refused to leave Ryan's side, still shaken, and Mason stood close to his father with protective awareness far beyond his years. Savannah sat down slowly, studying Ryan with new clarity. "You left medicine completely?" she asked, her voice no longer commanding but curious. Ryan nodded. "After my wife passed, I realized I was saving strangers while missing the person who mattered most. I didn't want Mason growing up with a father who was always almost there." The simplicity of his answer struck harder than any shareholder criticism ever had. Savannah had always justified her absence as sacrifice for Chloe's future, yet in that moment, she wondered if she had confused provision with presence. Before she could respond, her assistant's phone buzzed again sharply. "Savannah," she said anxiously, "a video of you collapsing is already online. Some board members are invoking the executive fitness class. They're questioning your stability." The words should have ignited fury or defensive strategy, but instead Savannah felt something unexpected: clarity. She looked at Chloe, who was still watching her closely, fear lingering in her expression. Ryan stepped forward calmly. "They'll spin this as weakness," he said, analyzing the situation with the same steady tone he had used minutes earlier. "But it isn't weakness. It's exhaustion. There's a difference." Savannah met his gaze. "They won't see it that way." Ryan gave a small, confident nod. "Then show them differently." The next morning, Savannah walked into the emergency board meeting not alone, but with Chloe beside her, and Ryan seated calmly one chair away. The room buzzed with tension as screens displayed still images from the restaurant video, slowed down for dramatic effect. A senior board member began outlining concerns about optics and executive resilience, but Savannah raised her hand, silencing the room. "Yes," she said evenly, "I experienced a stress episode. Because I've been running this company at a pace no human sustains indefinitely, and I won't pretend otherwise." The board exchanged uncertain glances. This was not the cold, untouchable leader they were accustomed to. "Leadership is not the absence of vulnerability," she continued. "It's the ability to correct course before real damage occurs." She then turned slightly toward Ryan. "Dr. Ryan Carter is a former trauma physician and crisis specialist. Last night, he stabilized me in minutes. More importantly, he reminded me what sustainable strength looks like." Ryan stood only when invited, presenting data he had reviewed overnight: employee burnout statistics, turnover rates, productivity declines linked to executive overextension. He spoke not as a maintenance worker or a social guest, but as a strategist who understood pressure from both medical and human perspectives. "If your CEO collapses," he said plainly, "it's not a failure of stamina. It's a symptom of a system that glorifies depletion." Silence followed. Shareholders who had arrived ready to challenge Savannah now leaned forward thoughtfully. She made her final announcement without hesitation. "Effective immediately, we are restructuring executive operations to prioritize long-term performance and mental resilience. Dr. Carter will join Whitmore Technologies as Director of Corporate Wellness and Crisis Strategy." The room stirred again, but this time with reluctant respect rather than doubt. The attempted leadership challenge dissolved within the hour. By the afternoon, public relations teams had reframed the narrative, not as a scandal, but as a powerful pivot toward modern leadership reform. That evening, back at Savannah's penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, the atmosphere felt entirely different from the marble formality of the restaurant. Mason and Chloe had constructed an elaborate blanket fort in the center of the living room, ignoring the untouched designer toys arranged along custom shelves, their laughter echoing freely through a space that had once felt like a showroom rather than a home. Ryan stood in the kitchen beside Savannah, sleeves rolled up again, helping plate simple pasta instead of gourmet cuisine. "You didn't have to do all this," he said gently. Savannah leaned against the counter, studying him. "Yes," she replied softly. "I did." She stepped closer to the glass wall overlooking the city lights. "I built my life proving I could compete with anyone, outwork anyone, outlast anyone. But Chloe doesn't need a competitor. She needs a mother." Ryan's expression softened. "And she has one." Chloe suddenly ran over and wrapped her arms around Savannah tightly, then looked up at Ryan. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" she asked with open hope. Mason grinned. "I think we're kind of a team now." Savannah met Ryan's eyes, the weight of pride replaced with something steadier. "You did the unbelievable last night," she said quietly. Ryan shook his head. "You did. You chose differently." And that was the truth. She had chosen to walk away from image and toward authenticity. To sit at a humble table instead of behind velvet ropes. To admit strain instead of deny it. As the four of them stepped onto the terrace together, the city humming below, Savannah felt something unfamiliar but deeply welcome: balance. The sunset stretched gold across the skyline, casting their shadows long and intertwined against the polished stone floor. Chloe slipped her hand into Mason's, their laughter rising into the evening air, while Ryan stood beside Savannah not as an outsider from a different world, but as someone who had quietly walked into it and shifted its foundation. The billionaire who had once measured success in stock surges and acquisition headlines now measured it in steady breathing, shared dinners, and a daughter who no longer looked afraid. And in that quiet, ordinary moment, Savannah Whitmore understood that the most extraordinary decision she had ever made was not a merger, not a product launch, not a strategic acquisition, but the simple act of choosing connection over control at a dinner table where she had least expected to find it.